Sometimes the most broken souls find each other when the world has given up on both of them. In a dusty Kansas town in 1877, everyone gathered to watch what they thought would be the last day of a vicious dog's life. The massive beast had scars covering his body and chains around his neck. 3 men had been mauled, and the whole town wanted him put down. But when drifter Cole Harlan stepped forward with a single silver dollar, everything changed. Nobody understood why a man would claim such a dangerous animal. The townspeople called Cole crazy and warned he'd be dead within a week. They named the dog Brutus, and slowly, something remarkable began to happen. The feared creature became Cole's loyal companion, watching over his camp and sensing dangers that others missed. When cattle rustlers started threatening the local settlers, Cole and Brutus stood together against the threat. The same dog everyone wanted destroyed became the frontier's most unlikely protector. But what was it about this broken-down cowboy that could tame a beast everyone else feared? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hung low over Mercy Creek, Kansas territory, casting long shadows across the dusty main street where the auction had taken place just hours before. Cole Harlan walked slowly toward the edge of town, the silver dollar he'd bid still warm in his memory, while behind him trudged the massive dog that half the county now figured would kill him by morning. Brutus, as Cole had already decided to call him, moved with the careful gait of an animal that had learned to expect pain. The chains had been replaced with a thick rope around his neck, but the scars told a story that went deeper than iron links. Jagged white lines crisscrossed his dark coat where teeth and claws had found their mark. His left ear hung at an odd angle, and a long scar ran from his right eye to his muzzle, giving him a permanent squint that made him look even more menacing. Cole had seen that look before, in mirrors and in the faces of men who'd survived things they shouldn't have. The dog's amber eyes held something familiar, not just pain, but a wariness that came from being hurt by those who should have shown kindness. Every step Brutus took was measured, calculated, ready to defend or flee at the first sign of threat. "Easy, boy," Cole murmured, his voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who'd spent years gentling spooked horses and wounded soldiers. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." The dog's ears twitched at the sound, but he didn't look up. Trust, Cole knew, was something that had to be earned one careful moment at a time. As they reached the outskirts of town, Cole pulled out a worn leather journal from his saddlebags. The pages were filled with careful sketches and notes about animal behavior, observations he'd made during his wandering years. There were drawings of wild mustangs, wounded deer, even a mountain lion he'd once helped free from a trap. Each sketch was accompanied by detailed notes about approach, temperament, and the subtle signs that separated a truly dangerous animal from one that was simply afraid. He flipped to a fresh page and began sketching Brutus's profile, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way he favored his left hind leg, and the careful way he tested each step before committing his full weight. These were the details that mattered, the small truths that revealed the difference between viciousness and vulnerability. Sheriff Morton had followed them out of town, his weathered face creased with concern. "Cole, I know you mean well, but that dog's dangerous." Doc Henley counted 23 stitches on Billy Crawford after that animal got hold of him. Cole looked up from his journal, studying the sheriff's face. Morton was a good man, fair and honest, but like most folks, he saw what he expected to see. "What happened before the dog bit Billy?" "Well, Billy was—" Morton stopped, his frown deepening. "Hell, Cole, does it matter?" The dog attacked him. "It always matters," Cole said quietly. He'd learned that lesson in the war, when quick judgments could mean the difference between life and death. A dog doesn't attack without reason. Might not be a good reason, might not be a fair reason, but there's always a reason. The sheriff shook his head. You're taking an awful risk. That beast could turn on you the moment you let your guard down." Cole glanced at Brutus, who had settled into a watchful crouch about 10 feet away, close enough to observe, far enough to run if needed. It was the behavior of an animal that had learned to survive on its own terms. Maybe, but I've found that most creatures, when they're treated with respect and given a fair chance, they remember kindness longer than they remember hurt. As the sheriff rode back toward town, Cole set up his simple camp in a grove of cottonwoods by the creek. He moved slowly and deliberately, making no sudden gestures that might startle his new companion. He'd learned patience in the army, during those long nights when he'd served as a scout for General Sherman's forces, watching, waiting, reading the landscape for signs that others missed. Brutus maintained his distance, but Cole noticed the dog's attention never wavered. Those amber eyes tracked every movement, every sound. When Cole built his fire, Brutus's ears pricked forward at the familiar crackle of burning wood. When Cole opened his pack and pulled out strips of dried beef, the dog's nostrils flared, but he didn't approach. Instead, Cole tore off a piece of meat and tossed it gently toward Brutus, not close enough to seem threatening, but near enough to show intent. The dog stared at the offering for long minutes before cautiously moving forward to sniff it. He ate quickly, gulping the food as if expecting someone to snatch it away. "Take your time," Cole said softly, tossing another piece. "There's plenty more." As darkness settled over the camp, Cole pulled out his journal again and wrote by firelight. The pages held more than just animal observations. They contained fragments of memories, thoughts about the places he'd been and the people he'd met. Tonight, he wrote about the moment at the auction when he'd seen something in Brutus's eyes that reminded him of himself. There had been a time, not so long ago, when Cole had been the one everyone expected to turn violent, to break under the weight of what he'd seen and done. After Appomattox, when the war ended and the surviving soldiers were turned loose to find their way back to lives that no longer existed, he'd wandered the country like a ghost. Some nights, he'd catch his own reflection in a creek or a window and see the same guarded wariness that now marked Brutus's face. The war had taken things from him, his family's farm burned by raiders, his brother killed at Chancellorsville, his faith in the notion that good always triumphed over evil. But it had also taught him something valuable about the difference between broken and irreparable. He'd seen men who seemed beyond saving find their way back to humanity through simple acts of decency and understanding. Martha Caldwell, the woman who owned the saloon in Mercy Creek, had watched the auction with the mixture of curiosity and disapproval that marked most of the town's reactions to Cole's bid. She was a practical woman, sharp-eyed and quick-tongued, who'd built her business by reading people accurately. As Cole had led Brutus away, she'd shaken her head and muttered something about fools and their money. But Martha had also been the one to quietly slip Cole an extra portion of bread when he'd eaten at her place the night before, and she'd asked careful questions about his travels that suggested genuine interest rather than mere nosiness. She was the kind of person who judged actions more than appearances, and Cole suspected she might come around to understanding his choice, given time. Doc Henley was another matter entirely. The town's physician was a man who believed in clear categories: healthy or sick, sane or crazy, safe or dangerous. He treated the men Brutus had injured, and in his mind, that made the dog a medical problem with a simple solution: put it down before it hurt anyone else. Cole could respect the logic, even if he disagreed with the conclusion. The most intriguing reaction had come from Sarah Mitchell, the schoolteacher who'd been standing near the edge of the crowd during the auction. She was new to Mercy Creek, having arrived only a few months earlier from back east, and she watched events with the careful attention of someone still learning the local customs. When Cole had made his bid, she'd been the only person in the crowd who hadn't gasped or called out in shock. Instead, she'd studied his face with thoughtful brown eyes, as if trying to understand what she was seeing. Sarah was young, perhaps 25, with the kind of quiet intelligence that showed in the way she carried herself. She wore simple dresses that spoke of practicality rather than fashion, and her hands bore the ink stains of someone who spent her days teaching children to read and write. There was something about her that suggested she understood what it meant to be an outsider, to be judged before being known. As the fire burned lower, Cole noticed that Brutus had gradually moved closer to the warmth. The dog still maintained a careful distance, but his posture had relaxed slightly. His head rested on his front paws, though his eyes remained alert, tracking the movements of shadows beyond the firelight. Cole reached slowly for another piece of dried meat, this time holding it out in his open palm rather than tossing it. Brutus watched the gesture with intense focus, his whole body tense with the conflict between hunger and caution. For several minutes, neither moved. Then, with careful steps, the dog approached. His approach was a masterclass in controlled wariness. Each step was tested before full weight was committed. His eyes never left Cole's face, reading every micro-expression for signs of deception or threat. When he was close enough to reach the meat, he stretched his neck forward while keeping his body positioned for quick retreat. The moment their skin touched Brutus's wet nose against Cole's palm, something passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. The dog took the meat gently, almost delicately, before backing away to eat it in safety. Cole smiled and made a note in his journal. Day 1. Contact established. Subject shows intelligence and restraint. Scarring extensive but appears superficial. Behavioral responses suggest learned caution rather than inherent aggression. Probable history of abuse or neglect. Recommend patience and consistency in approach. The night sounds of the Kansas prairie surrounded them, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of wind through grass, the splash of fish jumping in the creek. Brutus's ears swiveled constantly, cataloguing each sound and filing it away as either normal or worthy of attention. Cole found himself impressed by the dog's alertness and discrimination. This was an animal that had learned to survive on its own terms, to read danger in the subtlest signs. As Cole prepared to settle in for the night, he spoke quietly to his companion. Tomorrow, we'll start figuring out who you really are under all that fear. But for tonight, we'll just sit together and listen to the world settle down around us. Brutus didn't respond, but his breathing had become more regular, less sharp with anxiety. It was a small thing, but Cole had learned to value small victories. They were often the foundation upon which larger transformations were built. The last entry in his journal that night was brief but significant. Sometimes, salvation comes in the form of silver dollars and second chances. Both the giver and the receiver can be transformed by a single act of faith. 3 days later, the morning calm was shattered by the thunder of hoofbeats and the desperate cries of a woman in distress. Cole was teaching Brutus basic commands by the creek when they both heard it, the unmistakable sound of trouble racing toward town. Widow Patterson's buckboard came careening down the main street, her normally neat grey hair wild around her face, her dress torn at the shoulder. Behind her, black smoke rose from the direction of her ranch, like a signal fire against the pale sky. Cole and Brutus reached town just as the widow pulled her exhausted horses to a stop in front of the sheriff's office. She was shaking, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her weathered cheeks. But her voice was steady when she spoke. They came at dawn, she said to the gathering crowd. 15, maybe 20 men, took every head of cattle I had and burned my barn for good measure, shot my dog when he tried to protect the animals. Sheriff Morton helped her down from the buckboard, his face grim. Did you recognize any of them, Mrs. Patterson? Strangers, all of them, but they knew what they were doing. This wasn't some bunch of drifters looking for easy pickings. They were organized, professional. She looked around at the faces gathered in the street. One of them left this behind. From her apron pocket, she pulled a blood-stained bandana, dark blue with a distinctive pattern of silver stars. The fabric was fine quality, not the rough cotton most cowboys wore. Someone in the crowd whistled low. "That's expensive cloth," said Martha from the saloon doorway. "Whoever dropped that has money to spend." Cole examined the bandana without touching it, noting the way the blood had soaked into the fabric. Fresh blood, still damp around the edges. This was torn from someone in a hurry, he observed, caught on something sharp, fence wire maybe, or a broken board. Brutus had remained close to Cole's side throughout the exchange, but now the dog's demeanor changed. His ears pricked forward, and his nostrils flared as he caught the scent of the blood-stained cloth. A low growl rumbled in his chest, not threatening, but alert. It was the sound of an animal recognizing danger. Doc Henley emerged from his office across the street, medical bag in hand. "Mrs. Patterson, you look like you could use some attention. That shoulder." "I'm fine," she said sharply, then softened her tone. "Thank you, Doc, but there's no time. They said they'd be back. Said this was just the beginning." She turned to Sheriff Morton. "What are we going to do?" Morton's weathered face showed the strain of a man facing a problem bigger than his resources. Mercy Creek was a small town, peaceful by frontier standards, and his experience ran more towards settling disputes over property lines than dealing with organized cattle thieves. "I'll send word to the territorial marshal," he said finally. "Maybe he can spare some men to—" "That could take weeks," interrupted Tom Brennan, who owned the largest spread outside of town. "These bastards could strip every ranch in the county clean before help arrives." Cole had been listening quietly, but now he stepped forward. "What direction did they head when they left?" Mrs. Patterson pointed southeast, toward Devil's Canyon. "But Cole, you can't be thinking of going after them alone. There were too many of them, and they were well armed." "Not going after them," Cole said, "but I might take a look at what they left behind. Sometimes you can learn a lot about a man from the way he works." The crowd stirred uneasily. They still saw Cole as an outsider, a drifter with a dangerous dog, and the idea of him involving himself in their troubles sat poorly with some. "This isn't your fight, stranger," said Jake Morrison, the blacksmith. "We appreciate the offer, but—" "Actually," Cole interrupted gently, "I think it might be." He knelt down and let Brutus sniff the bandana again. The dog's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His hackles rose, and he let out a sound that was part whine, part growl. It was the sound of an animal recognizing something from its past. "Your dog knows that scent," observed Sarah Mitchell, who had been watching from the schoolhouse steps. She approached carefully, her intelligent eyes moving between Cole and Brutus. "He's afraid of it." Cole nodded, his expression thoughtful, or angry. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. He stood and looked around at the gathered townspeople. "Mrs. Patterson, would you be willing to let me and Brutus take a ride out to your place? We might be able to track which way they really went, maybe get a sense of how many we're dealing with." The widow studied his face for a long moment. "You think you can handle 20 armed men?" "I think I can learn things about them that might help us all handle them when the time comes," Cole replied. "But I need to see their work firsthand." Sheriff Morton shifted uncomfortably. "Cole, I appreciate the offer, but tracking rustlers is dangerous work. And that dog of yours, no offense, but he's still an unknown quantity." As if summoned by the comment, Brutus moved closer to Cole's side. The great dog's eyes swept the crowd, not aggressively, but with the alertness of an animal assessing potential threats. His scars caught the morning sunlight, telling their silent story of past violence, but his posture was controlled, disciplined. "He's not unknown to me," Cole said quietly. "And from his reaction to that bandana, I'd say these rustlers aren't unknown to him either." The implication hung in the air like smoke from Mrs. Patterson's burned barn. If Brutus had encountered these men before, it suggested a history that went deeper than simple cattle theft. Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "What would you need from us?" The question surprised some of the townspeople, but Cole appreciated her directness. Information, mainly. Has anyone else noticed strangers in the area lately? Men asking questions about ranches, cattle counts, security arrangements. Tom Brennan scratched his beard thoughtfully. Now that you mention it, there was a fellow in Martha's place about 2 weeks ago. Well-dressed, polite enough, but he was asking an awful lot of questions about who owned what land around here. Martha nodded. I remember him. Paid in silver, tipped well, but there was something about him that didn't sit right. He knew too much about our business for someone just passing through. What did he look like? Cole asked. Tall, dark hair, expensive clothes, had a scar running along his jawline, and his hands were softer than most men's out here. But he wore a gun, like he knew how to use it. Cole absorbed this information, filing it away with other details. Anyone else see him? I did, said Sarah. He stopped by the school one afternoon, said he was thinking about settling in the area and wanted to know about educational opportunities for children. But he didn't ask the kinds of questions a father would ask. He was more interested in who lived where and how often people traveled to town. The picture that emerged was troubling but not unexpected. Professional rustlers often spent weeks studying their targets, learning routines, identifying weaknesses. What worried Cole was the systematic nature of it. This wasn't opportunistic theft, but a carefully planned operation. Sheriff Morton made his decision. All right, Cole, you can take a look at the Patterson place, but I want you to report back by sunset. And for God's sake, don't engage if you encounter them. We need information, not heroes. As the crowd began to disperse, Cole prepared for the ride out to the Patterson ranch. Brutus stayed close, his earlier agitation settling into focused alertness. The dog seemed to understand that they were embarking on something significant, something that would test the fragile trust they'd been building. Mrs. Patterson approached as Cole was checking his rifle. There's something else, she said quietly. Something I didn't want to say in front of everyone. Cole waited, recognizing the tone of someone about to share information they'd rather keep private. When they were loading my cattle, I heard one of them call another by name. Jack, he said. But not just Jack, Black Jack. She paused, studying Cole's face. You know that name? Cole's expression went still, and beside him, Brutus whined softly as if sensing his companion's sudden tension. Blackjack Morrison wasn't a name from Cole's recent past. It was a ghost from the war, a Confederate deserter who'd made his reputation burning Union supply wagons and murdering prisoners. I know the name, Cole said carefully. If it's the same man, we're dealing with someone a lot more dangerous than simple cattle thieves. The widow nodded grimly. That's what I was afraid of. Cole, if this Morrison fellow has some kind of grudge. He might, Cole admitted, but that's all the more reason to find out what we're really facing. Sometimes the best way to handle a snake is to know exactly where it likes to hide. As they prepared to leave town, Cole noticed Sarah watching from the schoolhouse steps. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and she gave him a small nod, not of farewell, but of understanding. She knew, as he did, that what happened in the next few hours would determine whether Mercy Creek faced a simple criminal problem or something far more personal and dangerous. The blood-stained bandana sat in Sheriff Morton's office like evidence of a crime not yet committed, but Cole carried the memory of Brutus's reaction with him as they rode toward the Patterson ranch. Whatever lay ahead, he was no longer riding alone. The bond between man and dog, forged in trust and tested in hardship, would be their strength against whatever darkness was gathering on the horizon. The ride to the Patterson ranch gave Cole time to work with Brutus in a way that felt natural rather than forced. Instead of formal training commands, he began incorporating whistles and gestures into their travel, noting how quickly the dog learned to associate specific sounds with different actions. Cole pulled out a piece of cottonwood he'd been whittling during their quiet moments by the creek and finished shaping it into a small whistle. The wood was smooth and white, and when he blew through it, It produced a clean, sharp note that cut through the prairie wind without being harsh. Brutus's ears perked up immediately at the sound. "That's for attention," Cole said, giving the whistle another short blast. "When you hear that, it means, look to me for direction." They practiced as they rode, Cole using the wooden whistle to signal direction changes, stops, and alerts. Brutus seemed to understand instinctively that this was communication rather than domination, and he responded with an eagerness that surprised them both. The burned ruins of the Patterson barn came into view just after midday, the blackened timbers still smoking in places. Cole dismounted and let Brutus explore the scene while he examined the tracks left by the rustlers. The dog's nose worked constantly, cataloging scents and following trails invisible to human eyes. What Cole found confirmed his worst suspicions. The tracks were too organized, too methodical for simple cattle thieves. The rustlers had spread out in a precise pattern, surrounding the ranch buildings and controlling every possible escape route. This was military planning, the kind of tactical thinking that came from years of organized warfare. But it was Brutus who made the most significant discovery. The dog had been following a scent trail that led from the barn to a small grove of trees behind the house. Suddenly, he stopped and began digging furiously at the base of an old oak tree. His claws threw dirt and leaves in all directions as he worked to uncover something buried in the shallow soil. "What is it, boy?" Cole approached carefully, not wanting to startle the dog in his intense focus. Brutus stepped back and whined, his ears flattened against his head. Cole knelt and brushed away the remaining dirt, revealing a canvas bag that had been hastily buried. Inside, he found personal items, a woman's locket, a child's wooden toy, a man's pocket watch, the kind of things people took when they fled their homes in fear. The implications were chilling. These weren't just cattle thieves, they were raiders who drove families from their homes and claimed their land. The systematic nature of it suggested they'd done this before, probably many times. Cole pocketed the items and made a note of their location. When this was over, he'd make sure they found their way back to their rightful owners. But right now, they were evidence of a pattern that extended far beyond Mercy Creek. The whistle proved its worth during their investigation. Cole used different combinations of notes to direct Brutus's attention to specific areas, and the dog responded with increasing confidence. By the time they finished examining the ranch, they were working together with a fluidity that felt almost natural. As they prepared to head back to town, Cole took out his journal and made detailed notes about everything they'd observed. The tracks, the buried items, the systematic way the buildings had been searched and destroyed, it all pointed to Black Jack Morrison's hand. The man Cole remembered from the war had been methodical, ruthless, and utterly without conscience when it came to civilians. But there was something else nagging at him, something about Brutus's reaction to the blood-stained bandana and his behavior at the ranch. The dog hadn't just been alert, he'd been personally affected, as if these scents and sounds triggered specific memories. Cole thought back to the stories he'd heard about Brutus's past. The dog had supposedly attacked 3 men, but what if the truth was more complex? What if Brutus had been defending someone or something from attackers who'd later claimed to be the victims? The ride back to town was quiet, both man and dog lost in their own thoughts. Cole used the time to practice with the whistle, developing a vocabulary of signals that could communicate complex ideas with simple sounds. Brutus seemed to enjoy the mental challenge, his intelligence showing in the way he adapted to new commands and even anticipated Cole's intentions. As Mercy Creek came into view, Cole saw a small crowd gathered in front of the schoolhouse. Sarah Mitchell was there, along with several children and their parents. They were all looking in his direction with expressions of curiosity and concern. Sarah approached as he dismounted. "How did it go? Find anything useful?" Cole showed her the items they'd discovered, explaining their significance. Her expression grew more serious as she understood the implications. "This isn't just about cattle, is it?" she said. "No, ma'am, it's not." Cole looked at the children gathered around the schoolhouse, their faces bright with the innocence that would make them easy targets for men like Black Jack Morrison. These people are claiming territory, driving out anyone who won't cooperate or can't defend themselves. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What about Brutus? He seems different somehow." Cole had noticed it too. The dog's confidence had grown during their investigation, as if having a job to do had awakened something that had been dormant. "I think he's remembering what it feels like to have a purpose," Cole said. "Animals need to feel useful, just like people do." As they talked, one of the children, a boy of about 10, with sandy hair and curious eyes, approached cautiously. "Mister, is that the mean dog everyone's talking about?" Cole smiled. "This is Brutus, and he's not mean. He's just been hurt and needs time to learn to trust again." The boy studied Brutus with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "He doesn't look mean, he looks sad." It was such a simple observation, but it cut straight to the truth. Sarah knelt down beside the boy. "Tommy, what makes you think he looks sad?" "His eyes," the boy said matter-of-factly. "Same way my pa looked when he came back from the war, like he'd seen things he wished he hadn't." Cole felt something tighten in his chest. Children often saw things that adults missed, unfiltered by preconceptions and social expectations. He knelt down and held out the wooden whistle. "Would you like to help me teach Brutus something new?" he asked. Tommy's face lit up, and he looked to his mother for permission. She nodded hesitantly, still wary of the scarred dog, but trusting Cole's judgment. Cole showed Tommy how to hold the whistle and produce a clear note. When the boy blew it, Brutus immediately sat and focused his attention on the sound. The children gasped in delight, and even the adults seemed impressed by the dog's discipline and responsiveness. "Now," Cole said, "this whistle means pay attention. When Brutus hears it, he knows someone wants to communicate with him. It's not a command, it's a conversation." He had Tommy practice the whistle several more times, with Brutus responding perfectly each time. The dog seemed to enjoy the attention and praise from the children, his tail actually wagging for the first time since Cole had known him. Sarah watched the interaction with thoughtful eyes. "You're not just training him," she observed. "You're healing him." "Same thing, really," Cole replied. "Trust has to be earned on both sides. He's learning that people can be kind, and the people here are learning that he's not the monster they thought he was." As the impromptu training session continued, Cole noticed Sheriff Morton approaching with a concerned expression. The lawman had clearly seen the children interacting with Brutus and wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. "Cole might want to be careful about that," Morton said quietly. "If something goes wrong, nothing's going to go wrong," Cole said with quiet confidence. "Watch him, Sheriff. Really watch him. That's not an aggressive animal, that's a protector learning to protect again." As if to prove the point, Brutus suddenly lifted his head and looked toward the edge of town, his ears pricked forward in alert attention. A moment later, they all heard what he had already detected, the sound of approaching horses, moving fast and hard. 3 riders came into view, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with urgency. They pulled up in front of the crowd, and the lead rider, a man Cole recognized as Sam Houston from the Triple H Ranch, dismounted quickly. "Sheriff, we got trouble," Houston said, breathing hard. "The Hendricks place was hit this morning, same pattern as the Patterson Ranch, cattle stolen, buildings burned, family driven off their land." The whistle in Tommy's small hand suddenly seemed less like a toy and more like a tool of war. Cole took it gently from the boy and slipped it into his vest pocket, his expression already shifting from teacher to soldier. "How many this time?" he asked. "Same group, near as we can tell. But Sam, tell them about the message." Houston's face darkened. "They left word. Said anyone who wants to keep their land and their lives better be prepared to pay tribute. 20% of all cattle delivered to Devil's Canyon every month." The crowd stirred uneasily. This was no longer a matter of isolated raids. It was organized extortion on a scale that could destroy the entire community. Cole looked down at Brutus, who had remained alert and focused throughout the exchange. The dog met his eyes with a steady gaze that seemed to say he was ready for whatever came next. "Looks like our training's going to get more practical sooner than I expected," Cole murmured, and gave the wooden whistle a soft, experimental blow. Brutus responded immediately, his attention sharp and focused. Man and dog stood together as the afternoon shadows lengthened, both understanding that their real test was just beginning. That evening, Cole spread his faded military map across the table in Martha's saloon, the edges worn soft from years of folding and unfolding. The map showed the Kansas territory with the kind of detail that came from military reconnaissance, not just towns and rivers, but elevation changes, natural defenses, and strategic positions that could be held with minimal forces. Sheriff Morton, Tom Brennan, and several other ranchers gathered around the table while Martha served coffee and kept curious ears away from their conversation. Brutus lay beneath the table, close enough to Cole's feet that he could feel the dog's warmth, but positioned so he could watch the room's entrances. "Here's what we're dealing with," Cole said, pointing to various locations on the map. "The Patterson Ranch, the Hendricks place, and if they're following the pattern I think they are, they'll hit the Morrison spread next." He traced a line connecting the three ranches. "See the pattern? They're working their way in a circle, hitting the most isolated places first." Tom Brennan studied the map with a cattleman's eye for terrain. "That would put them here next," he said, tapping a spot southeast of town. "The Walker family. They've got good grazing land, but they're almost 10 miles from the nearest neighbor." Cole nodded grimly. "And after that, they'll start hitting places closer to town. The goal isn't just to steal cattle, it's to establish control over the entire area." "So what do we do?" asked Sheriff Morton. "We can't guard every ranch in the county." Cole pulled out his journal and flipped to a page covered with tactical sketches. "We don't guard them all. We make it too expensive for them to keep operating. Military theory says, you force an enemy to fight on ground of your choosing, at a time of your choosing." He pointed to a narrow canyon marked on the map. "Devil's Canyon. That's where they're taking the stolen cattle, and it's the perfect place for an ambush if you know the terrain and have the right positioning." The men studied the topographical markings with new understanding. The canyon had steep walls on both sides and only 2 practical entrances. For rustlers, it was an ideal holding pen for stolen livestock. For defenders, it was a trap waiting to be sprung. "You're talking about going after them directly," Morton said slowly. "I'm talking about making them come to us," Cole corrected. "But first, we need to know exactly what we're facing." Over the next hour, they planned a reconnaissance mission to Devil's Canyon. Cole would take Brutus and scout the rustlers' camp, gathering intelligence about their numbers, weapons, and defenses. The information would determine whether they could handle the threat themselves or needed to send for territorial help. As the meeting broke up, Cole noticed Brutus had become increasingly restless. The dog kept looking toward the saloon's windows, his ears twitching at sounds the humans couldn't hear. When Cole stepped outside to investigate, Brutus immediately moved to the edge of the wooden sidewalk and stared into the darkness beyond the town's lights. A moment later, Cole heard it too, the distant sound of a horse moving carefully through the brush outside town. Not the normal movement of a traveler on the main road, but the cautious progress of someone trying to avoid detection. Cole whistled softly, using the pattern he'd taught Brutus to mean alert but quiet. The dog responded by lowering his profile and focusing his attention in the direction of the sound. Together, they moved silently toward the edge of town. The rider was about 200 yards out, sitting motionless on his horse while studying the town's layout. In the moonlight, Cole could make out the silhouette of a well-built man wearing a hat with a distinctive wide brim. As he watched, the rider pulled out what looked like a spyglass and methodically surveyed the main street, noting the locations of the sheriff's office, the bank, and other key buildings. Brutus tensed beside him, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The sound was so quiet that Cole felt it more than heard it, but the dog's reaction told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a curious traveler, this was a scout, probably one of Morrison's men, gathering information for a future attack. Cole reached slowly for his rifle, but before he could bring it to bear, the rider wheeled his horse and disappeared into the darkness. The man had completed his reconnaissance and vanished like smoke, leaving behind only the memory of his presence and the certain knowledge that Mercy Creek was being watched. Back in the saloon, Cole shared what they'd observed with Sheriff Morton. The implications were sobering. If Morrison's gang was scouting the town itself, they were planning something bigger than simple cattle raids. "We need to accelerate our timeline," Cole said. "If they're already planning to hit the town, we can't wait for them to pick off the outlying ranches one by one." Morton nodded reluctantly. "When do you want to scout their camp?" "Tomorrow night," Cole replied. "The longer we wait, the stronger they get and the weaker our position becomes." As they finalized their plans, Sarah Mitchell appeared in the saloon doorway. She'd been waiting for the meeting to end, and now she approached with the determined expression of someone who'd made a difficult decision. "I want to help," she said simply. The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. Having a schoolteacher involved in military planning went against every instinct they had about protecting women and civilians. "Miss Mitchell," Morton began, "we appreciate the offer, but nothing," she interrupted firmly. "I know this area better than any of you realize. I've been exploring the countryside since I arrived, mapping out safe routes for the children to take home from school. And I've seen things, tracks, campsites, places where the grass has been trampled by large groups of horses." Cole studied her with new respect. "What kind of things?" Sarah pulled out a small notebook of her own, filled with careful observations written in a neat hand. "There's a hidden trail that leads from Devil's Canyon to a series of smaller canyons to the east. It's not marked on any map I've seen, but it's been used recently by large groups of riders." She showed them her sketches, revealing a level of detail that impressed even Cole. Sarah had documented water sources, defensible positions, and alternate routes with the precision of a trained scout. "How did you learn to observe terrain like this?" Cole asked. "My father was a surveyor," she replied. "He taught me to read the land, to see what others miss. And during the war, I helped map safe routes for families fleeing the fighting in Missouri." The revelation added a new dimension to Sarah's character. She wasn't just a school teacher who'd wandered west, looking for adventure. She was someone with real experience in dangerous situations. Tom Brennan looked up from her notebook. "Miss Mitchell, if this trail exists, it means they can move cattle in and out of Devil's Canyon without using the main entrances. That changes everything." Cole nodded thoughtfully. "It also means they can escape if we try to trap them in the canyon. But it could work both ways. If we know about the trail and they don't know we know, we can use it against them." As they revised their plans to account for Sarah's intelligence, Cole noticed that Brutus had moved closer to her. The dog seemed to approve of her presence, his earlier alertness relaxing into acceptance. Animals were good judges of character, and Brutus's reaction told Cole that Sarah could be trusted. The next morning brought news that confirmed their worst fears. A rider arrived from the Walker Ranch with word that the family had been attacked during the night. This time, however, the pattern had changed. Instead of simply driving the family away, Morrison's men had taken them prisoner. "They left a message," the rider said, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. "Said anyone who wants to see the Walker family alive again better bring $1,000 in gold to Devil's Canyon by sunset tomorrow." The demand transformed the situation from harassment to kidnapping, raising the stakes beyond anything the community had faced before. Cole looked at his military map with new urgency, understanding that their reconnaissance mission had suddenly become a rescue operation. Brutus seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. The dog moved restlessly around the room, his earlier calm replaced by focused tension. When Cole knelt to examine the map more closely, Brutus pressed against his side, offering silent support for whatever lay ahead. "We can't wait for tonight," Cole said finally. "If they have hostages, every hour we delay increases the danger." Sheriff Morton stood slowly, his weathered face showing the weight of command. "What do you need from us?" Cole looked around the room at the faces of ordinary people being forced to make extraordinary decisions. "I need you to trust me and Brutus to get close enough to scout their defenses, and I need everyone to be ready to move fast when we get back." As preparations began for what might be the most dangerous mission any of them had ever undertaken, Cole took a moment to study his faithful companion. Brutus met his gaze with steady amber eyes that seemed to say he was ready for whatever came next. The wooden whistle in Cole's pocket felt heavier now, weighted with the responsibility of lives hanging in the balance. But as he looked at the map and began planning their approach to Devil's Canyon, he felt a quiet confidence that came from knowing he wouldn't be facing the danger alone. Man and dog had found each other in a moment of desperation, and now they would be tested in the crucible of violence and courage. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, they would face it together. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Cole and Brutus approached Devil's Canyon from the northwest, following Sarah's carefully mapped route through terrain that would keep them hidden from the main trails. Cole had studied her sketches until he could navigate by memory, but seeing the landscape firsthand revealed details that no map could capture. The canyon was a natural fortress, carved by centuries of flash floods into a maze of stone walls and hidden passages. What made it perfect for hiding stolen cattle also made it treacherous for anyone trying to approach undetected. One wrong turn could lead to a dead end, and the sound of a horse's hooves on stone would carry for miles in the still air. Cole dismounted about a mile from the canyon entrance and secured his horse in a grove of mesquite trees. From here, they would proceed on foot, using Brutus's superior senses to guide them through the approach. The dog had been alert since they'd left town, his demeanor shifting from companion to working partner. Cole had seen the same transformation in military dogs during the war animals that understood the difference between training and combat, and adapted their behavior accordingly. As they worked their way closer to the canyon, Cole began finding signs of the rustlers' presence. Fresh horse tracks in the sand, discarded food tins, and the unmistakable smell of a large camp carried on the wind. Brutus catalogued each scent with focused intensity, his nose working constantly to build a mental map of the area. It was the dog who first detected the guard post. Brutus suddenly froze, his ears pricked forward, and his body tense with alert attention. Cole followed his gaze and spotted the glint of metal among the rocks. About 50 yards ahead, a rifle barrel reflecting the afternoon sunlight. Using hand signals he'd developed during their training, Cole directed Brutus to circle around the guard position while he approached from the opposite direction. The dog moved with surprising stealth for such a large animal, his paws finding silent purchase on the rocky ground. The guard was positioned to watch the main approach to the canyon, but he wasn't expecting an attack from two directions. Cole was able to get within 20 feet before the man sensed movement. By then, it was too late. Cole's rifle was already trained on him, and Brutus had positioned himself to cut off any escape route. "Don't move," Cole said quietly. "Don't call out, and don't reach for your weapon." The guard was young, probably not much past 20, with the nervous energy of someone new to this kind of work. His eyes darted between Cole and Brutus, clearly unsure which posed the greater threat. "Easy," Cole continued, his voice calm and steady. "I'm not here to hurt you, but I need information. How many men are in the canyon?" The young man's face showed the internal conflict between loyalty and self-preservation. After a moment, fear won out. 15, maybe 20. "I don't know for sure, men come and go." "What about the Walker family? Are they hurt?" "They're alive," the guard said quickly. "Boss has them in the old mine shaft at the back of the canyon, says they're insurance in case things go bad." Cole filed away this information while considering his next move. He couldn't leave the guard free to warn the camp, but he also couldn't bring himself to harm an unarmed man who was cooperating. "What's your name?" he asked. Billy Cobb." "Well, Billy, you've got a choice to make. You can ride out of here right now and keep riding until you're well clear of Kansas territory, or you can stay and take your chances with what's coming." The young man's eyes widened. "You're going to attack the camp?" "I'm going to rescue the Walker family," Cole corrected. "What happens to the men holding them depends on how reasonable they want to be." Billy looked at Brutus, who had remained motionless but alert throughout the conversation. "That's the dog everyone's talking about, isn't it? The one that's supposed to be killer." "He's a protector," Cole said simply, "but he protects the people who deserve protecting." After a moment's consideration, Billy made his decision. He slowly reached for his horse's reins, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I never signed up for kidnapping families," he said. "This was supposed to be about cattle." As Billy rode away, Cole felt a mixture of relief and concern. The young man's departure would reduce the number of enemies they faced, but it also started a clock ticking eventually. Someone would notice that the guard post was unmanned. Cole and Brutus continued their approach to the canyon, moving with increased urgency. The intelligence Billy had provided was valuable, but it also confirmed Cole's worst fears about what they were facing. A defended position with hostages was one of the most difficult tactical situations to resolve successfully. The canyon entrance was a narrow gap between towering stone walls, barely wide enough for two riders to pass abreast. Cole could see why Morrison had chosen this location. It was easily defended and virtually impossible to assault directly, but Sarah's hidden trail might provide the advantage they needed. Using Brutus as an early warning system, Cole worked his way around the canyon's perimeter until he found the trail Sarah had described. It was little more than a game path worn into the rock by decades of animal traffic, but it led up and over the canyon wall, providing access to the interior from an unexpected direction. The climb was treacherous, especially with a large dog. But Brutus proved surprisingly agile on the rocky terrain. His powerful legs and low center of gravity allowed him to navigate ledges and crevices that would have challenged a mountain goat. From the top of the canyon wall, Cole could see the entire rustler camp spread out below. The stolen cattle were penned in a natural corral at the wide end of the canyon, while the men had made their camp near a series of caves that provided shelter from the weather. Cole counted 17 men, most of them gathered around cooking fires as they prepared their evening meal. They moved with the casual confidence of people who believed they controlled the situation completely. None of them were looking up. Their attention was focused on the canyon entrances and the approach routes that any conventional attack would use. Near the back of the canyon, Cole could see the mine shaft Billy had mentioned. Two men stood guard outside what appeared to be a narrow opening in the rock face. Even from his elevated position, Cole could see that the guards were alert and well armed. As he studied the scene below, Cole began to notice something that made his blood run cold. Among the horses picketed near the camp, he spotted a distinctive iron horseshoe lying on the ground, not the standard flat horseshoe used by most cowboys, but a specialty shoe with raised ridges and a unique pattern of nail holes. He'd seen that pattern before, years ago during the war. It was the mark of a military farrier who'd shod horses for Confederate cavalry units. More specifically, it was the mark of the farrier who'd worked for Black Jack Morrison's irregular unit, a signature as distinctive as a fingerprint. The horseshoe confirmed what Cole had suspected but hoped wasn't true. This wasn't just someone using Morrison's name for intimidation, this was Morrison himself, along with survivors from his old unit. Men who'd fought together, killed together, and shared the bitter taste of defeat when the war ended. Brutus sensed Cole's tension and pressed closer to his side. The dog's warm presence was comforting, but it also reminded Cole of the magnitude of what they were facing. These weren't simple criminals, they were veteran soldiers, with nothing left to lose and a grudge that stretched back to the darkest days of the war. As the sun began to set, Cole started working his way back down the canyon wall. He'd seen enough to plan their approach, but he'd also learned that the rescue would be far more dangerous than anyone in Mercy Creek had imagined. The wooden whistle in his pocket seemed to pulse with significance as he considered the signals he'd need to coordinate a complex operation. Whatever happened next would test every skill he'd learned in war and every bond he'd built with his unlikely partner. Brutus followed him down the treacherous path with sure-footed confidence, but Cole could see the dog's alertness had increased even further. They were no longer just scouting, they were preparing for battle against an enemy that knew how to fight and had no intention of surrendering without taking as many opponents with them as possible. The iron horseshoe with its distinctive markings would haunt Cole's thoughts during the ride back to town. It was more than evidence, it was a message from the past, a reminder that some conflicts echo across years and demand a final resolution. The ride back to Mercy Creek gave Cole time to wrestle with memories he'd tried to bury. The iron horseshoe with its distinctive markings had opened a door to the past that he'd hoped would stay closed forever. As Brutus trotted beside his horse, alert to every sound and movement in the gathering darkness, Cole found himself remembering another time, another place, when he'd tracked Black Jack Morrison through terrain not unlike this Kansas prairie. It had been the spring of 1864, and Cole was serving as a scout for General Sherman's forces in Georgia. Morrison was a Confederate deserter who'd taken to raiding Union supply lines with a band of irregulars men who'd abandoned their units but continued fighting a private war that recognized no rules and showed no mercy. The first time Cole had encountered Morrison's work, he'd found a burned-out farmhouse where a family of Union sympathizers had been murdered in their sleep. The second time, it was a wagon train of medical supplies attacked while carrying wounded soldiers to a field hospital. Morrison's signature was always the same violence that went far beyond military necessity, cruelty that served no strategic purpose except to spread fear. Cole had spent 3 weeks tracking Morrison's band through the Georgia countryside, learning their patterns and predicting their movements. He'd finally cornered them at a crossroads near a small town called Millfield, where Morrison had made the mistake of trying to rob the local bank in broad daylight. The confrontation had been brief but decisive. Cole's military training and careful preparation had given him every advantage except one. Morrison had taken hostages, townspeople who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Cole had been forced to watch as Morrison escaped with his remaining men, using innocent civilians as human shields. But before fleeing, Morrison had looked directly at Cole and spoken words that still echoed in his memory. "This ain't over, boy. Someday, we'll finish what we started here." The broken spurs Billy had described confirmed Cole's worst suspicions. Morrison still wore the distinctive cavalry spurs he'd taken from a Union officer he'd killed during a raid. The spurs had been damaged in their final confrontation at Millfield. Cole had put a rifle bullet through the left spur's rowel, sending Morrison tumbling from his horse before the man managed to escape. Now, 13 years later, Morrison was making good on his promise. The cattle rustling, the systematic terrorizing of homesteaders, the escalation to kidnapping, it was all leading to this moment when past and present would collide in the Kansas territory. Cole reached Mercy Creek as the town was settling in for the night. Lamplight flickered in windows, and the sounds of normal evening activities, children being called in for supper, dogs barking at distant coyotes, the soft murmur of conversation on front porches reminded him of what they were fighting to protect. Sheriff Morton was waiting at the saloon along with Tom Brennan, Sarah Mitchell, and several other townspeople who'd volunteered to help with the rescue. Their faces showed the strain of people who'd spent the day preparing for violence while hoping it could be avoided. "What did you find?" Morton asked as Cole and Brutus entered the saloon. Cole spread his map on the table and began marking positions based on what he'd observed. 17 men, well-armed and organized. The Walker family is being held in an old mine shaft at the back of the canyon, with 2 guards posted outside. 17, breathed Tom Brennan. That's more than we figured. And they're not ordinary cattle thieves, Cole continued. I found evidence that this is Black Jack Morrison's band, Confederate irregulars who've been together since the war. They know how to fight, and they won't surrender easily. Sarah studied the map with her surveyor's eye for detail. What about the trail I mapped? Can we use it for the approach? It's our best chance, Cole acknowledged, but it'll still be dangerous. These men have experience with ambushes and defensive positions. As they refined their plans, Cole noticed that Brutus had positioned himself where he could watch the saloon's entrance while staying close enough to participate in the conversation. The dog's behavior had evolved considerably since their arrival in town, from fearful isolation to active engagement in the community's welfare. Martha brought coffee and sandwiches, her normally sharp tongue subdued by the gravity of the situation. "Cole," she said quietly, "you sure about this? Maybe we should send for the territorial marshal, wait for professional help." "The Walker family doesn't have time for us to wait," Cole replied. "And Morrison's not going to get weaker while we're sending messages and hoping for cavalry that might not arrive." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside, the sound of horses arriving at speed, followed by urgent voices. Sheriff Morton stepped out to investigate and returned a moment later with grim news. "Rider from the Hendricks place," he said. "They've been hit again, but this time it was different. Morrison's men didn't take cattle. They took every horse on the ranch and left a message. The message was written on a piece of paper torn from a child's school tablet. The words formed in the careful handwriting of someone educated but trying to disguise their script. The people of Mercy Creek have one day to bring $50 in gold to Devil's Canyon. If the money is not delivered by sunset tomorrow, the Walker family will pay the price for your stubbornness." Cole stared at the message, recognizing the psychological warfare that had been Morrison's specialty during the war. The escalating demands, the shortened timeline, the threat to innocent lives. It was all designed to force hasty decisions and create panic. $5,000, said Tom Brennan slowly. "The whole town doesn't have that kind of money." "He knows that," Cole said. "This isn't about money, it's about control. He wants us desperate and frightened, making mistakes." Sarah had been studying the message with thoughtful attention. "There's something else," she said. "Look at the paper. This is from my school supplies. I recognize the blue lines and the grade of paper. Someone who took this had access to the schoolhouse." The implication sent a chill through the room. If Morrison's men had been inside the school, they'd been gathering intelligence about the town's layout, its vulnerabilities, and its people. The systematic nature of their planning was even more extensive than Cole had feared. Brutus suddenly lifted his head, his ears pricked forward in alert attention. A moment later, they all heard what he'd detected: the sound of a single horse approaching town at a walking pace. Not the urgent gallop of a messenger, but the careful approach of someone trying to avoid attention. Cole moved to the window and peered through the curtains. In the moonlight, he could see a rider dismounting near the edge of town. The figure was too distant to identify, but there was something familiar about the way he moved, confident, deliberate, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Sheriff," Cole said quietly, "I think Morrison's come calling." The rider tied his horse to a fence post and began walking down the main street, his spurs ringing against the wooden sidewalk with each step. The sound was distinctive, the broken rhythm of damaged metalwork that Cole remembered from their confrontation years ago. As the figure passed under a street lamp, Cole got his first clear look at Black Jack Morrison in 13 years. The man had aged, his hair now more grey than black, and his face bore new lines of hardship and violence. But his posture was unchanged, the straight-backed arrogance of someone who believed the world owed him whatever he chose to take. Morrison stopped in front of the saloon and called out in a voice that carried clearly through the night air. "Cole, Harlan, I know you're in there. Time we finished our conversation from Georgia." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Everyone in the saloon looked at Cole, understanding that this confrontation had roots that went deeper than cattle rustling or territorial disputes. Cole checked his pistol and rifle, then looked down at Brutus. The dog met his gaze with steady amber eyes that seemed to say he was ready for whatever came next. "Stay close," Cole murmured to his companion, then stepped toward the saloon door. Outside, Black Jack Morrison waited in the moonlight, his hands resting casually on his gun belt. Behind him, the shadows seemed to hold shapes that might have been other riders, watching and waiting for their leader's signal. The broken spurs caught the lamplight as Morrison shifted his weight, and Cole could see the damage his rifle bullet had done all those years ago. Some wounds never healed, they just waited for the right moment to reopen and finish what they'd started. 13 years is a long time to hold a grudge, Cole said as he stepped into the street. Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Some debts don't have a statute of limitations, boy. You cost me good men at Millfield. You cost yourself those men when you decided to rob banks instead of fighting soldiers." The exchange was ritual, formal as a duel, but Cole knew it was really about something deeper. Men like Morrison couldn't accept defeat. They carried it like poison until it destroyed everything they touched. Brutus had followed Cole into the street, and now the dog stood at his side with quiet confidence. Morrison's eyes flicked to the scarred animal, and for the first time, his expression showed surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," Morrison said softly. "You kept him." The words hit Cole like a physical blow, suddenly making sense of Brutus's reaction to the blood-stained bandana and his behavior at the Patterson ranch. Morrison knew the dog had probably owned him, used him, maybe been the one responsible for those scars. "He was yours," Cole said, understanding flooding through him. "Best tracker I ever had," Morrison replied. "Shame you had to steal him along with everything else." But as Cole looked at Brutus, he saw something that Morrison had missed. The dog wasn't cowering or showing signs of recognition. Instead, he was standing protectively close to Cole, his eyes fixed on Morrison, with the alert attention of an animal that had found something worth defending. Whatever had happened between Morrison and Brutus in the past, the dog had made his choice about the present. And that choice filled Cole with a quiet confidence that would carry him through whatever came next. The revelation that Morrison had once owned Brutus changed everything, but not in the way Cole expected. As he studied the dog's reaction to his former master, Cole realized that Brutus wasn't showing fear or recognition. He was showing the focused attention of an animal that had identified a threat to his current pack. "You always did have a talent for taking things that didn't belong to you," Morrison continued, his voice carrying across the empty street. "First my dog, then my men at Millfield, and now you're trying to steal my livelihood here in Kansas." "Your livelihood is built on terrorizing innocent families," Cole replied. "That's not something worth protecting." Morrison's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Boy, you still don't understand what we're dealing with here. These innocent families you're so worried about, they're the ones who've been feeding information to the territorial marshal, trying to bring federal troops down on my operation." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Cole felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as he considered the implications. If Morrison was telling the truth, it meant there were connections between the townspeople and outside authorities that nobody had mentioned. "You're lying," Cole said, but even as he spoke, he was remembering details that suddenly took on new significance. Sarah's extensive knowledge of the area, her careful mapping of trails and defensible positions, her quick insertion into their planning sessions, all could be explained by reconnaissance training that went beyond what a surveyor's daughter would need. Morrison seemed to read his thoughts. "Ask your schoolteacher about her real reason for coming to Kansas territory. Ask her about the letters she's been sending to Fort Leavenworth." Ask her why she knows so much about military tactics for someone who's supposed to be teaching children their letters. Behind Cole, he could hear movement in the saloon as the townspeople reacted to Morrison's words. Voices rose in confused discussion, and he caught fragments of conversation that suggested Morrison's revelation was as much a surprise to them as it was to him. But it was Brutus's reaction that convinced Cole there was truth in Morrison's accusations. The dog had turned his attention away from Morrison and was now looking back toward the saloon, his ears pricked forward and his posture alert. Whatever scents or sounds he was detecting, they were coming from behind Cole, not from the threat in front of him. Even if that's true, Cole said carefully, it doesn't justify kidnapping the Walker family, doesn't it? Morrison's voice took on a philosophical tone that Cole remembered from their previous encounters. When someone's trying to destroy your way of life, you use whatever tools are available. The Walkers were unfortunate enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. As Morrison spoke, Cole became aware of subtle movements in the shadows around the town, shapes that might have been men, positioned to control the main street and cut off escape routes. The realization that he was surrounded came gradually, like dawn breaking over a battlefield. "You've been planning this for a long time," Cole said. 13 years, Morrison confirmed. "Ever since Millfield. I knew someday we'd cross paths again, and I wanted to be ready." The sound of footsteps behind him made Cole turn, and he saw Sarah Mitchell emerging from the saloon. But something about her posture had changed. The careful deference was gone, replaced by the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Cole," she said, her voice carrying a different authority than he'd heard before. "I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you." Brutus moved closer to Cole's side, positioning himself between his master and Sarah. The dog's instincts were proving more reliable than human judgment, and Cole found himself trusting the animal's assessment of the situation. "You're not really a school teacher," Cole said. "It wasn't a question." "I am a school teacher," Sarah replied, "but I'm also a federal agent working for the territorial government. I was sent here to investigate reports of organized criminal activity in the area." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with sickening clarity. Sarah's knowledge of the terrain, her quick understanding of tactical situations, her careful documentation of everything she observed, all were consistent with someone conducting a federal investigation. "So Morrison's right," Cole said. "You've been sending reports to Fort Leavenworth." "Yes," she admitted, "but not about innocent families. About criminal organizations that are terrorizing homesteaders and undermining territorial authority." Morrison's voice cut through the night air with sardonic amusement. "Touching, isn't it? How the federal government cares so much about a few scattered ranches that they'd send their own people to play schoolmarm." Cole was trying to process the implications when Brutus suddenly tensed and let out a low growl. The dog was staring at a point beyond Morrison, where the shadows seemed to be moving with purpose. "There's something else you need to know," Sarah said urgently. "Morrison's operation isn't just about cattle rustling. We have evidence that he's been accumulating weapons and supplies for a much larger operation." "What kind of operation?" Cole asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. It was Morrison who replied, his voice filled with the fervor of a true believer. "The kind that takes back what was stolen from us at Appomattox. The war isn't over, boy, it just moved west." The revelation hit Cole like a physical blow. Morrison wasn't just a criminal, he was still fighting the Civil War, gathering resources and followers for some grand scheme of continued resistance. "The weapons cache," Cole said, remembering Brutus's earlier discovery. "You've been stockpiling arms, enough to outfit a regiment," Morrison confirmed proudly. "And not just rifles and ammunition, artillery pieces, cavalry equipment, even uniforms, for when we're ready to take the field again." Sarah stepped closer, her voice urgent. "Cole, there's a hidden weapons depot somewhere near Devil's Canyon. We've been trying to locate it for months, but Morrison's people have been too careful." The irony wasn't lost on Cole. He was standing between a federal agent and a Confederate holdout, both of whom needed his help for their own purposes. And in the middle of it all, the Walker family was still being held hostage by men who saw them as expendable pawns in a larger game. Brutus's low growl intensified, and Cole realized the dog was reacting to sounds and movements that human ears couldn't detect. Morrison's men were moving into position, surrounding the town while their leader kept Cole distracted with revelations and accusations. "How many men do you really have?" Cole asked Morrison. "More than you can handle," came the reply. "And they're all veterans, boys who remember what it was like when we fought for something that mattered." The sound of breaking glass came from somewhere behind the saloon, followed by shouts of alarm. Morrison's assault on the town had begun while Cole was standing in the street, paralyzed by conflicting loyalties and uncertain allegiances. "Cole!" Sheriff Morton's voice carried from the direction of his office. "They're coming from all directions." Brutus barked once, sharp and urgent, then moved toward the sound of gunfire. The dog had made his choice protect the pack, regardless of politics or past grievances. Cole looked at Sarah, then at Morrison, understanding that whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of Mercy Creek, but the final resolution of conflicts that had been simmering since the war's end. "Where's the weapons cache?" Cole demanded, his rifle now trained on Morrison. Morrison smiled coldly. "Close enough to matter, far enough away that you'll never find it in time." More gunfire erupted from the direction of the bank, and Cole could see muzzle flashes reflecting off windows as Morrison's men moved through the town. They weren't just attacking, they were executing a coordinated assault designed to control key positions and eliminate resistance. Sarah drew a pistol from beneath her schoolteacher's dress, revealing that she'd been armed all along. "Cole, we need to get to the weapons depot before Morrison can move the cache. If those weapons reach other Confederate holdout groups, the Walker family comes first." Cole interrupted. "I don't care about your federal investigation or his lost cause. Those people are innocent and they're going to die if we don't act." Morrison's expression showed genuine surprise at Cole's priorities. Still the same boy from Millfield, choosing civilians over the bigger picture. "Some things don't change," Cole agreed, then whistled sharply to Brutus. The dog immediately responded, moving to Cole's side with alert readiness. But as Cole prepared to move toward the sounds of battle, he noticed something that chilled him to the bone. The weapons depot Morrison had been so secretive about Brutus had already found it. The dog's earlier discovery of buried personal items hadn't been random. He'd been following a scent trail that led to something much larger and more dangerous. "Sarah," Cole said urgently, "your maps of the area. Where exactly did you mark those hidden trails?" She pulled out her notebook, flipping to the detailed sketches she'd made. "Here, and this one leads to—" She stopped, her face going pale as she understood what Cole had realized. "The schoolhouse," Cole finished. "The weapons are hidden under the schoolhouse." Morrison's laughter was genuinely appreciative. "Took you long enough to figure it out. Where better to hide military supplies than under the place where the next generation learns to be good American citizens?" The full scope of Morrison's plan became clear in that moment. The attacks on the ranches, the escalating demands, the kidnapping of the Walker family, all of it was designed to draw attention away from the real objective. While everyone was focused on Devil's Canyon and cattle rustling, Morrison's men had been moving their weapons cache to a location where it could be loaded onto wagons and transported to Confederate sympathizers throughout the territory. "The children," Sarah whispered, understanding the implications. "If those weapons are stored under the school and something goes wrong—" She didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone in town knew that Sarah's schoolhouse sat on a foundation of old mine shafts and natural caves. If the weapons cache included explosives, as most military depots did, any mistake could bring down half the building and endanger anyone nearby. Cole's tactical mind began working through the implications. Morrison had positioned his men throughout the town, but their real objective was to secure the schoolhouse and load the weapons before federal troops could arrive. The attack on Mercy Creek wasn't about conquest, it was about covering a massive theft of military supplies. "How long before your people from Fort Leavenworth arrive?" Cole asked Sarah. "They're not coming," she admitted reluctantly. "I'm operating alone, gathering intelligence for a larger operation that hasn't been approved yet." The revelation meant they were truly on their own, facing a coordinated assault by veteran soldiers who had been planning this operation for months. But it also meant that Cole was free to act without worrying about federal oversight or conflicting objectives. Brutus suddenly barked and charged toward the shadows, where Morrison's men were positioned. The dog had spotted movement that the humans had missed, and his warning came just in time. Rifle fire erupted from 3 directions, forcing Cole and Sarah to dive for cover behind a water trough. Morrison melted back into the darkness, his broken spurs ringing against wooden sidewalks as he moved to coordinate his men's assault. But before disappearing completely, he called out one final challenge. "The Walker family has until dawn, boy." After that, they become casualties of war. As bullets splintered the wood around them, Cole realized that the weapons cache under the schoolhouse had fundamentally changed their situation. They weren't just dealing with cattle rustlers or even Confederate holdouts. They were facing an enemy who had access to military-grade equipment and the training to use it effectively. "We need to get to that cache before they do," Sarah said, reloading her pistol with practiced efficiency. "We need to rescue the Walker family before Morrison decides they're more trouble than they're worth," Cole countered. Brutus returned from his charge, unharmed but clearly agitated. The dog had driven off the immediate threat, but his behavior suggested that more danger was approaching from multiple directions. The hidden weapons depot represented a threat that extended far beyond Mercy Creek, but Cole's conscience wouldn't let him sacrifice the Walker family for the greater good. He'd made that choice before, at Millfield, and the memory still haunted him. "There's a third option," Cole said finally. "We use Morrison's own plan against him." Sarah looked at him with questioning eyes, and Cole began outlining a strategy that would require precise timing, absolute trust, and the kind of coordination that only came from complete understanding between partners. As he spoke, Brutus moved closer, his amber eyes reflecting the lamplight from nearby windows. The dog seemed to understand that they were planning something dangerous, and his presence provided the confidence Cole needed to attempt what might be an impossible rescue. The hours before dawn stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Cole and Sarah had taken refuge in the church, the only building in town that offered both defensive positions and a clear view of the schoolhouse where Morrison's men were working to extract their weapons cache. Through the stained glass windows, they could see lantern light moving back and forth beneath the building, casting eerie shadows as the Confederate holdouts prepared for their largest operation since the war's end. Brutus lay at Cole's feet, alert but conserving energy for what lay ahead. The dog had proven invaluable during their reconnaissance, using his superior senses to track the movements of Morrison's men while avoiding the patrols that swept through town every hour. Cole was busy assembling what Sarah had initially thought were simple mining supplies from the church's storage room. Lengths of fuse cord, small containers of black powder meant for clearing stumps, and metal fragments that could serve as shrapnel. To her trained eye, however, his work had the precise efficiency of someone who'd built improvised explosives before. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked quietly. "Army engineers," Cole replied without looking up from his careful measurements. "Sherman's march through Georgia required removing a lot of obstacles, both natural and man-made. The makeshift explosive devices were crude but effective, designed to create maximum noise and confusion rather than massive destruction. Cole's plan required precise timing and careful placement, and he was building tools that could accomplish both objectives. Sarah had been working on her own preparations, using her knowledge of the schoolhouse's underground layout to sketch possible approach routes and escape paths. Her federal training had included architectural assessment, and she could see structural weaknesses that might be exploited if Morrison's men made mistakes with their heavy weapons. "The support beams under the main classroom are already compromised," she noted, pointing to her sketches. "If there's a significant explosion down there, the whole building could collapse." "That's what I'm counting on," Cole said grimly. "Morrison thinks he's got us trapped between his men in town and his weapons cache underground. But if we can force him to choose between the weapons and his escape route—" A sharp whistle from outside interrupted their planning. Brutus immediately raised his head, recognizing the signal as one of Cole's communication codes. Someone was approaching the church, moving carefully but not attempting complete stealth. Cole moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. Tom Brennan was approaching from the direction of his ranch, leading his horse and carrying what appeared to be a heavy saddlebag. His clothes were torn and dirty, suggesting he'd been traveling hard across rough country. "Tom's back," Cole whispered to Sarah, "and he's carrying something important." They let Brennan into the church through a side door, and his first words confirmed Cole's suspicions. "I found their main camp," he said, breathing hard from exertion and adrenaline, "about 15 miles northwest of Devil's Canyon, hidden in a box canyon that doesn't show on any map." He opened his saddlebag and pulled out items that made Sarah gasp in recognition: military dispatch cases, ammunition boxes marked with Confederate insignia, and most significantly, a leather portfolio containing detailed maps of the entire Kansas territory. "They're not just planning to steal weapons," Brennan continued. "They're mapping out a campaign that would give them control of the whole territory. Supply lines, defensive positions, recruitment centers, everything they'd need to restart the war." Cole studied the captured maps with growing concern. Morrison's operation was far more extensive than anyone had imagined, involving multiple groups scattered across several states. The weapons cache under the schoolhouse was just one component of a larger strategy that could destabilize the entire frontier. "How many men at the main camp?" Sarah asked. "Maybe 30. But they're expecting reinforcements. I overheard them talking about a supply train coming from Arkansas, carrying enough weapons to outfit a full regiment." The revelation added urgency to their situation. If Morrison's men succeeded in moving the weapons cache from Mercy Creek to their main camp, they'd have the resources to launch operations that could affect thousands of innocent settlers. But it was Brutus who made the discovery that changed their entire approach. The dog had been examining the items Brennan brought back, his nose working intently over each object. Suddenly, he focused on one particular dispatch case, whining softly and pawing at the leather. Cole opened the case and found what appeared to be routine military correspondence, but Brutus's reaction suggested there was something more. Hidden behind the official papers, Cole found a small notebook written in Morrison's distinctive handwriting. The notebook contained detailed observations about individual townspeople in Mercy Creek, their routines, their weaknesses, their potential value as hostages or sources of information. But most chilling were the entries about Sarah herself. "Federal Agent Sarah Mitchell," Cole read aloud, "arrived in town 3 months ago undercover as schoolteacher, has been conducting surveillance and sending reports to Fort Leavenworth. Recommend elimination once weapons transfer is complete." Sarah's face went pale as she understood the implications. Morrison had known about her true identity from the beginning, and her investigation had been compromised from the start. "He's been playing us," she said quietly. "Everything we thought we knew about his operation, he wanted us to know it." Cole continued reading, finding entries that revealed the true scope of Morrison's intelligence network. The man had informants throughout the territory, people who reported on federal activities and helped coordinate Confederate resistance efforts. But it was the final entry that made Cole's blood run cold. "Walker family secured as insurance. If federal intervention occurs, execute hostages and destroy weapons cache to prevent capture." acceptable losses for the greater cause. The notebook made it clear that Morrison was prepared to kill the Walker family rather than allow them to be rescued. He saw them as expendable assets in a larger campaign, and their deaths would serve as a warning to other communities that might consider resisting his operations. "We're running out of time," Cole said, checking his pocket watch. "Morrison's men will start moving the weapons at first light, and if they feel threatened, they'll kill the Walkers," Sarah finished. Cole began distributing his improvised explosive devices, explaining how each one was designed to create specific effects. The plan he developed was complex and dangerous, requiring split-second timing and absolute coordination between all participants. "Tom, you'll take position near the schoolhouse and wait for my signal. When you see the mirror flash, you'll light the first charge and then run like hell for the creek." He handed Sarah a signal mirror polished to a bright sheen. "You'll be on the roof of the general store, using this to coordinate our movements. When Brutus and I reach the Walker family, you'll signal Tom and then cover our retreat." The plan was ambitious and full of potential failure points, but it offered their best chance of rescuing the hostages while preventing Morrison from achieving his larger objectives. Success would require not just courage and skill, but the kind of trust that could only exist between people who tested each other in crisis. As they prepared to leave the church, Cole knelt beside Brutus and spoke quietly to his companion. "This is going to be the hardest thing we've ever done together, boy. But those people are counting on us, and we're not going to let them down." Brutus met his gaze with steady amber eyes, and Cole saw in them the reflection of his own determination. Whatever happened in the next few hours, they would face it as they had everything else together, with absolute trust in each other's courage and commitment. The signal mirror caught the first rays of dawn as Sarah climbed to her position, sending brief flashes of light that told Cole and Brutus that the final phase of their mission was beginning. Morrison's men were already moving around the schoolhouse, preparing to load their weapons cache onto waiting wagons. Time was running out, but Cole felt the familiar calm that came before action. He'd planned as carefully as circumstances allowed, positioned his allies for maximum effectiveness, and prepared contingencies for the most likely complications. Now it was time to trust in training, instinct, and the bond between a man and a dog that had been forged in mutual rescue and tested in shared danger. The mission to save the Walker family and stop Morrison's weapons transfer was about to begin, and failure was not an option either of them was prepared to accept. The attack began at sunrise, when the morning light would blind Morrison's sentries and give Cole and Brutus the best chance of reaching Devil's Canyon undetected. Sarah's signal mirror caught the first rays of dawn and sent a brilliant flash across the valley, the prearranged signal that meant commence operation. Tom Brennan lit the first improvised explosive at precisely the moment Sarah's mirror flashed. The device detonated beneath the schoolhouse with enough force to shake windows throughout Mercy Creek, sending Morrison's men scrambling for cover as smoke and debris filled the air around their weapons cache. The explosion served its intended purpose, creating chaos and drawing attention away from Cole and Brutus as they approached Devil's Canyon from the concealed route Sarah had mapped. But as they moved through the early morning shadows, Cole could hear more gunfire than he'd expected, suggesting that Morrison's men were fighting harder to protect their position than anticipated. Brutus led the way through terrain that would have challenged an experienced tracker, his nose guiding them around guard positions and natural obstacles that could betray their approach. The dog moved with the focused intensity of an animal that understood the stakes, every sense alert for signs of danger or opportunity. As they reached the canyon's rim, Cole could see the situation below was more complex than their intelligence had suggested. Morrison hadn't just been holding the Walker family in the old mine shaft. He'd been using the location as a command center for his entire operation. Maps were spread on tables outside the cave entrance, and several men in Confederate uniforms were coordinating movements with military precision. The Walker family was visible through the mine shaft entrance, bound but apparently unharmed. Two guards stood watch outside, but their attention was focused on the distant sounds of battle from Mercy Creek rather than the possibility of rescue from above. Cole used Sarah's signal mirror to flash a message back toward town: targets acquired, beginning descent. The mirror's reflection danced across the canyon walls, invisible to anyone not watching for it. But Sarah would understand that the rescue phase was starting. The descent into the canyon required mountaineering skills that Cole had learned during military operations in rough terrain. Brutus proved surprisingly adept at following the rope lines Cole anchored to secure points on the cliff face, his powerful legs and natural balance allowing him to navigate ledges that would challenge human climbers. They reached the canyon floor about 50 yards from the mine shaft, concealed behind a tumble of boulders that provided both cover and a clear view of their target. Cole could see that the guards were nervous, frequently looking toward the canyon entrance, where the sounds of distant explosions suggested their comrades were under attack. "Now," Cole whispered to Brutus, and the dog moved like a shadow through the rocks. Brutus approached the first guard from the blind side, using terrain features to mask his movement until he was close enough to strike. The guard's first warning was the sound of claws on stone, but by then it was too late. Brutus had already launched himself at the man's weapon hand, preventing any chance of raising an alarm. Cole took down the second guard with a combination of stealth and surprise that left the man unconscious but alive. These weren't the hardened criminals he'd expected. They were young men who'd been recruited with promises of glory and adventure, not understanding the reality of what they'd committed to. Inside the mine shaft, the Walker family looked up with expressions of hope and disbelief as Cole and Brutus appeared in the entrance. Mrs. Walker was clutching her two young children, while her husband sat with his hands bound, his face showing the strain of someone who'd spent hours expecting the worst. "Mr. Harlan?" Mrs. Walker whispered, as if afraid to believe rescue was possible. "Yes, ma'am," Cole replied, already working to cut their bonds. "We're going to get you out of here, but I need you to do exactly what I say without question." As he freed the family, Cole could hear the sounds of battle growing closer. Morrison's men were falling back from Mercy Creek, and some of them would inevitably retreat toward Devil's Canyon. The window for escape was closing rapidly. Brutus positioned himself at the mine shaft entrance, his ears pricked forward as he monitored approaching sounds. The dog's early warning system had already proven invaluable, and Cole trusted his companion's assessment of immediate threats more than his own human senses. The escape route Cole had planned involved retracing their path up the canyon wall, but with 4 civilians, including 2 children, the climb would be slow and dangerous. They needed an alternative that would get the Walker family to safety while allowing Cole and Brutus to continue their mission. It was Mrs. Walker who provided the solution. "There's another way out," she said quietly. "The mine shaft connects to a natural cave system that leads to the surface about a quarter-mile north of here." Cole had studied every available map of the area, but none had shown the cave system Mrs. Walker described. It was local knowledge, the kind of information that only came from people who'd lived and worked in the area for years. "Can you guide us through it?" he asked. "I think so," she replied. "My husband and I explored those caves when we were courting. It's been years, but I remember the general layout." The sound of horses approaching at a gallop made the decision for them. Morrison's men were returning to their base, and staying in the mine shaft would mean certain capture. Cole gathered the family around him and explained what they needed to do. "Mrs. Walker will lead you through the caves to safety," he said. "I'm staying here to make sure Morrison can't follow you." "What about you?" asked Mr. Walker. "How will you get out?" Cole looked at Brutus, who met his gaze with steady amber eyes. "We'll find our own way, but your family's safety comes first." As the Walkers disappeared into the cave system, Cole and Brutus prepared to face whatever came next. The sound of approaching riders was getting closer, and Cole could hear Morrison's voice calling out orders to his men. The signal mirror in Cole's pocket caught a shaft of sunlight filtering through the mine entrance, and he used it to send one final message to Sarah. Package delivered. Continuing mission. The response came back immediately, a series of flashes that translated to understood, good luck. Brutus moved to Cole's side as the first riders appeared at the canyon entrance. Morrison was among them, his broken spurs ringing against stone as he dismounted and approached the mine shaft, where he expected to find his hostages. Instead, he found Cole Harlan and the dog he'd once owned, standing together in the entrance like guardians of something sacred. The confrontation he'd been planning for 13 years was finally at hand, but the terms were not what he'd expected. "Hello, Jack," Cole said calmly. "Looking for something?" Morrison's face went through a series of emotions as he realized the implications of finding Cole and Brutus in the mine shaft instead of his hostages. Surprise gave way to anger, then to a cold fury that Cole remembered from their encounters during the war. "Where are they?" Morrison demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his pistol. "Safe," Cole replied simply, "which is more than I can say for your weapons cache in Mercy Creek." The distant sound of explosions from the direction of town confirmed Cole's implication. Morrison's carefully planned operation was falling apart, his years of preparation being destroyed by a handful of civilians and a dog he'd once considered his property. "You always did have a talent for being in the wrong place at the wrong time," Morrison said, his voice carrying the bitter edge of a man watching his dreams crumble. "Or the right place at the right time," Cole countered. "Depends on your perspective." Morrison's men had spread out behind him, creating a semicircle that blocked the mine shaft entrance. They were veteran soldiers, disciplined and dangerous, but Cole could see uncertainty in their faces as they realized their hostages had escaped and their mission was compromised. Brutus moved slightly forward, positioning himself between Cole and the nearest Confederate soldier. The dog's posture was alert but controlled, ready to respond to whatever command Cole might give. "You know this doesn't end here," Morrison said. "Even if you've disrupted this operation, there are others. The cause doesn't die just because one battle goes badly." "The cause died at Appomattox," Cole replied. "You're just too stubborn to bury it." Morrison's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Spoken like a true Union man. You never understood what we were fighting for, did you?" "I understood it perfectly," Cole said. "That's why I fought against it." The philosophical argument might have continued, but Brutus suddenly tensed and let out a low growl. The dog had detected movement in the cave system behind them, not the Walker family, who should have been long gone by now, but someone else approaching through the darkness. Cole realized with sinking certainty that Morrison had anticipated the possibility of escape through the caves and positioned men to intercept anyone who tried to use that route. The Walker family might have walked directly into another trap. "Clever," Morrison admitted, following Cole's gaze toward the cave entrance, "but not clever enough. Did you really think I wouldn't know about every possible escape route in my own territory?" The sound of approaching footsteps from the cave confirmed Cole's fears. Morrison's men were driving the Walker family back toward the mine shaft, eliminating their escape route and restoring the original tactical situation. "Now," Morrison continued, "we're back where we started. Except now you're my hostage as well, which simplifies things considerably." Cole's mind raced through possible responses, but the mathematics of the situation were stark. He and Brutus were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped between Morrison's men and the cave system where the Walker family was being recaptured. But as Cole considered their options, he remembered something from Morrison's notebook, the entry about destroying the weapons cache rather than allowing it to be captured. Morrison was prepared to sacrifice everything rather than admit defeat, and that psychological profile suggested a tactical approach. "You're right," Cole said, his voice carrying a note of resignation that wasn't entirely feigned. "You've won this round." Morrison's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "That's not like you, giving up so easily." "I'm not giving up," Cole replied. I'm just acknowledging reality. You've got the hostages, you've got the superior position, and you've got more men. But you've also got a problem. What problem? Cole smiled grimly. Sarah Mitchell and Tom Brennan aren't just attacking your weapons cache in town. They're destroying it. All of it. Your ammunition, your artillery pieces, everything you've been collecting for the past 13 years. The implication hit Morrison like a physical blow. His weapons cache represented years of careful accumulation, resources that couldn't be easily replaced. If it was truly being destroyed rather than captured, his entire operation would collapse. "You're lying," Morrison said, but doubt was creeping into his voice. "Am I?" Cole pulled out Sarah's signal mirror and angled it to catch the morning sunlight. "Want to send a message and find out." As Cole manipulated the mirror, sending flashes of light toward Mercy Creek, Morrison's attention was temporarily diverted. It was the opportunity Brutus had been waiting for a moment, when the enemy's focus was divided and their guard was down. The dog moved with explosive speed, launching himself at the nearest Confederate soldier, while Cole dove for cover behind a boulder. The mineshaft erupted in gunfire and confusion as Morrison's carefully controlled situation dissolved into chaos. Cole's pistol spoke twice, taking down the two men closest to the cave entrance where the Walker family was being held. Brutus had disabled another soldier and was already moving toward his next target, his powerful jaws and natural agility making him a formidable opponent in close quarters. But it was Morrison himself who posed the greatest threat. The Confederate leader had drawn his pistol and was taking careful aim at Brutus, his face twisted with the fury of a man who'd lost everything and wanted to destroy what he couldn't control. "No!" Cole shouted, rising from cover to deflect Morrison's shot. The bullet intended for Brutus caught Cole in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him sprawling against the mine shaft wall. But his desperate movement had accomplished its purpose. Morrison's shot had missed its intended target. Brutus turned at the sound of Cole's cry, his amber eyes blazing with protective fury. The dog had spent his early life being abused and abandoned, but he'd found something worth defending in Cole Harlan, and he wouldn't let it be taken away. Morrison tried to bring his pistol to bear on the charging dog, but Brutus was already too close. The animal's powerful jaws clamped down on Morrison's gun hand, and the pistol flew spinning across the rocky ground. The two adversaries went down in a tangle of teeth and claws, Morrison fighting desperately to escape, while Brutus held him with implacable determination. It was a contest between human cunning and animal loyalty, with the outcome dependent on which force proved stronger. Cole struggled to his feet, his wounded shoulder burning with pain, but his gun hand still steady. The remaining Confederate soldiers were retreating, their leader's defeat breaking their will to continue fighting. As the sound of gunfire faded, Cole heard new voices approaching from the direction of Mercy Creek. Sheriff Morton and a group of townspeople, drawn by the battle and ready to finish what had been started. Morrison lay on the ground where Brutus had pinned him, his broken spurs reflecting the morning sunlight, like symbols of a cause that had finally reached its end. The dog stood over his defeated opponent, alert but no longer aggressive, waiting for Cole's command. "It's over, Jack," Cole said quietly. "The war's finally over." Morrison's pistol lay shattered against the canyon wall, its broken barrel, a fitting metaphor for dreams that had been pursued too long and with too much violence. The weapons cache in Mercy Creek was destroyed, the hostages were safe, and the Confederate holdout movement had lost its most dangerous leader. As Sheriff Morton and his men took Morrison and his surviving followers into custody, Cole sank down beside Brutus and wrapped his good arm around the dog's neck. They had accomplished something that would have been impossible alone, the rescue of innocent lives and the prevention of a larger tragedy. The broken spurs that had started as a symbol of Morrison's defeat at Millfield had become the final chapter in a story of obsession and revenge that had consumed 13 years. But they had also witnessed the birth of something better, a partnership built on trust and loyalty that had proven stronger than hatred and more enduring than the bitterness of old wounds. 6 months later, the sound of church bells rang across Mercy Creek, their bronze voices carrying news of celebration rather than alarm. The new town bell, cast from the melted remains of Morrison's weapons cache, hung in a wooden tower that overlooked the main street where Cole and Brutus had once faced down the ghosts of war. Cole stood on the steps of the church, his left arm still stiff from the shoulder wound, but functional enough for the tasks that mattered most. Beside him, Brutus wore a blue ribbon around his neck, not the mark of ownership, but a symbol of respect from a community that had learned to see beyond scars to the character beneath. The occasion was the dedication of the new schoolhouse, built to replace the one damaged during the final confrontation with Morrison's men. Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium, no longer pretending to be just a schoolteacher, but openly acknowledged as both educator and federal agent. Her dual role had been accepted by the townspeople with the pragmatic tolerance of frontier communities that valued competence over conventional credentials. "Today we celebrate more than just a new building," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "We celebrate the truth that second chances can transform both individuals and communities when they're offered with courage and accepted with humility." The new schoolhouse was larger than its predecessor, designed to accommodate the growing number of families who'd moved to Mercy Creek since word spread about the community's successful resistance to organized crime. But more importantly, it was built on solid ground rather than the unstable foundation that had hidden Morrison's weapons cache. Among the crowd, Cole recognized faces that had become familiar over the months of recovery and rebuilding. Sheriff Morton, his weathered features showing more confidence than they had during the crisis. Tom Brennan, whose ranch had become a model for cooperative defense against future threats. Martha from the saloon, whose sharp tongue had gentled somewhat since witnessing how loyalty and trust could triumph over fear and suspicion. The Walker family sat in the front row, their children healthy and laughing as they played with other youngsters who saw Brutus not as a monster, but as a gentle giant who let them practice their reading by sharing stories aloud. Mrs. Walker caught Cole's eye and smiled, a gesture that carried all the gratitude words couldn't express. Doc Henley had been among the most transformed by recent events. The physician who'd once advocated putting Brutus down now served as the dog's unofficial veterinarian, treating the minor injuries that came from an active life while marveling at the animal's intelligence and loyalty. His medical training had helped him understand that behavior was often shaped by treatment, and he'd become an advocate for giving both animals and people the chance to prove their true nature. As Sarah concluded her remarks, she gestured toward Cole and Brutus. "But today's celebration belongs especially to those who showed us that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the willingness to act righteously despite that fear." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, but Cole felt most proud of Brutus's reaction to the attention. The dog remained calm and dignified, accepting praise without arrogance and maintaining the alert awareness that made him such an effective guardian. After the ceremony, Cole and Brutus walked through the town that had become their home. The changes were visible everywhere: new businesses, improved roads, and most importantly, the relaxed confidence of people who knew they could defend themselves against future threats. The sheriff's office displayed a new badge beside Morton's desk, a deputy marshal's star that had been offered to Cole in recognition of his service to the territorial government. He'd accepted the position with the understanding that his primary responsibility was to Mercy Creek and the surrounding ranches, not to distant federal authorities who might not understand local conditions. Sarah approached as they reached the center of town, her federal agent credentials now openly displayed alongside her teaching certificate. The dual identity that had once been a source of tension had become an asset, allowing her to coordinate between local and territorial law enforcement while maintaining her commitment to education. "Any regrets?" she asked, studying Cole's face for signs of the restlessness that had once driven him from place to place. Cole looked around at the community that had accepted both him and Brutus despite their troubled pasts. "None that matter," he replied. "Sometimes the best thing you can do is stop running and start building." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar figure, Billy Cobb, the young man who'd been serving as a guard at Devil's Canyon before choosing to ride away rather than participate in Morrison's final operation. He'd returned to Mercy Creek a month after the confrontation, seeking work and a chance to start over. "Mr. Harlan," Billy said, approaching with the respectful caution of someone who understood he was still earning trust. "I wanted to let you know the fence line on the north pasture is finished, and the cattle seem to be settling in well." Cole had given Billy work on his small ranch, partly out of practical need, but mostly because he believed in the possibility of redemption. The young man had proven to be a diligent worker and a quick learner, grateful for the opportunity to build something positive after his involvement with Morrison's gang. As Billy headed back to his work, Sarah smiled at Cole's investment in another second chance. "You seem to have a talent for seeing potential where others see only problems." "Learned it from experience," Cole replied, reaching down to scratch behind Brutus's ears. "Sometimes the most broken things become the strongest once they're properly mended." The afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the main street when a rider approached from the east, not the urgent gallop of an emergency, but the steady pace of someone carrying routine news. The territorial mail rider dismounted at the post office, his saddlebags heavy with letters and packages that connected Mercy Creek to the wider world. Among the mail was an official-looking document addressed to Cole, bearing the seal of the territorial governor. Sarah watched as he opened it, noting the subtle change in his expression as he read. "Good news or bad?" she asked. "Interesting news," Cole replied, showing her the letter. "The governor's establishing a new territorial ranger service, and he's offering me the position of regional commander." The offer represented recognition of Cole's success in dealing with organized criminal activity, but it also meant responsibility for a much larger area and the possibility of travel that would take him away from Mercy Creek for extended periods. "What will you tell him?" Sarah asked. Cole looked around at the town that had become home, then down at Brutus, who was watching the conversation with alert interest. "I'll tell him I'm honored by the offer, but I already have a job." That evening, Cole and Sarah walked to the edge of town where they could see the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Brutus ranged ahead of them, investigating scents and sounds with the relaxed attention of an animal that was alert but not anxious. "I have something to tell you," Sarah said as they reached their favorite spot overlooking the prairie. "The federal government is establishing a permanent territorial office here in Mercy Creek, and they've asked me to run it." Cole smiled, understanding the significance of her decision to stay. "That means you'll be giving up your traveling assignments. It means I'll be focusing on building something that lasts, instead of just investigating problems after they've already developed," she replied. "Sometimes the best way to prevent crime is to help communities become strong enough to resist it themselves." As they stood together watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Cole reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a drifter with no permanent connections, and Brutus had been a feared animal that everyone expected to destroy. Now they were part of a community that valued loyalty over perfection and measured character by actions rather than appearances. The transformation hadn't been easy. It had required courage from everyone involved and the willingness to look beyond surface impressions to deeper truths. The church bell rang the hour, its bronze voice carrying a message of peace and continuity across the prairie. The metal that had once been instruments of war now called people to worship, to learning, and to the daily work of building a civilization worthy of the sacrifices made to protect it. Brutus returned from his explorations and settled beside Cole and Sarah, his amber eyes reflecting the last light of day. The scars that marked his coat were still visible, but they no longer defined him. He'd become something greater than the sum of his wounds, a symbol of the possibility that existed when damaged souls found the courage to trust again. As the first stars appeared overhead, Cole reached into his pocket and pulled out the wooden whistle he'd carved during those early days of training. He gave it a soft blow, and Brutus immediately responded with alert attention. But instead of giving a command, Cole simply said, "Good boy, rest easy." The words carried all the weight of shared experience, mutual respect, and the quiet satisfaction that came from a job well done. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but tonight they could rest in the knowledge that they'd found something worth protecting and the strength to defend it. The wooden whistle went back into Cole's pocket, no longer just a training tool but a reminder of the bond that had transformed two broken souls into guardians of hope. In a world that often seemed dominated by violence and fear, they'd proven that loyalty and courage could still triumph. And as the prairie settled into peaceful darkness around Mercy Creek, the sound of the church bell faded into silence, leaving only the whisper of wind through grass and the quiet breathing of a community at rest. It was the sound of home, earned through hardship and defended with honor, a place where second chances bloomed into lasting redemption, and the most hated dog at the auction had become the town's most beloved protector.